Nestled on a side road in sleepy Delaware, Ohio, is a quiet little picnic park. This idyllic place is perfect to take your family for a short stroll or a quick lunch break on a weekend afternoon. Or it would be if it weren't for the ghosts that wander the area. You see, in the 1920s, a passenger train was running very late on a cold winter's day. It carried very important passengers on board who were making their annoyance with the delay very clear. Panicked, embarrassed, and annoyed, the conductor was pushing the machine to its limits, speeding through a narrow area where it would encounter a bridge over the Limestone Quarry. And as we all know, bridges ice first. Dozens of people died, either from the cars crashing into each other or from the 100-foot fall to the bottom of the quarry. Their spirits now wander the park, searching for peace and trying to find their way home. Welcome to A&A's Tall Tales. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Andrea.
And the legend we have for you today is Blue Limestone Park up in Delaware, Ohio.
Which we had the pleasure of visiting here very recently.
Just yesterday? A couple days ago? Yesterday.
It was just yesterday, which it feels like it was a lifetime ago, and it also feels like it was this morning.
Mondays are weird time bubbles.
Especially right before the holidays, Mondays.
Oh, yeah. So, kind of a little bit about the park. It has 3 quarries that I'm going to talk about, and then a tunnel, which is kind of the center of this legend. So, the main quarry pond is actually in the park on the east end of the railroad tracks. And then there's 2 other ponds on the other side of the tracks. One is basically just on the flip side of the tracks, and the other one is even further west than that. And by further west, I mean 4 feet west.
Yeah, but to be fair, it's definitely west, but it's across a 30-foot tall divider of pure rock.
Yeah, there's, telephone wires and high power lines running across that. So it's next to it, but it's not exactly next to it. Anyway.
Yeah.
So this legend of this train that apparently derailed in the 1920s is a super popular tale. I couldn't find anything. And remember in episode 1 when I was talking about who has time to sift through hundreds of articles and newspapers to look for one piece of information? The answer is me. The answer is me. I went through probably 200 newspapers looking for any accident from like 1900 to 1930 that would even remotely in the same area as this park was, and I couldn't find anything. The closest I found was actually on the other side of town, so probably like 5 miles east. There's another set of tracks that had a couple accidents, but I couldn't find anything, and I looked real hard.
If you went through 200 newspapers, you didn't just look, you turned over every rock there is.
I mean, I like Control F search through them, so...
Yeah, but still. And having gone there, there's definitely a huge discrepancy between the pictures that we found online of the park and where the railroad tracks are compared to standing on the pier out in the middle of the pond and looking up at least 150 feet to the railroad track. So
yes,
the depth perception just from looking at photos is deceiving. It's a very tall, very sheer cliff with a narrow track perched on top. That track is the only thing that separates Pond 1 from Pond 2. It was very impressive.
Yeah, distance and height and scale is very weird in that park because the tunnel itself is actually really close. If you look at it on the map, it looks like it's going to be a hike. It's only a couple hundred yards from the closest parking lot to the tunnel. You don't even have to walk that far.
No, you can almost see the tunnel through the woods this time of year. You enter the woods and walk about 15 feet and you're at the creek, and another 10 feet or so and there's the tunnel.
And looking at pictures of the tunnel, it looked very small, but it was probably surface water to the top of the arch on the inside, about 30 feet tall, which isn't small.
No.
And then it was probably another 20 or so feet wide end to end.
And then when we walked through the tunnel, my best guess is it's between 45 and 60 feet long.
I actually found today, I was looking for some more information and found some very useful tidbits. The tunnel was actually added in 1895. They redid the railroad trestle and the embankment and added the tunnel. So it's only been there since 1895.
Only.
The specs had to be wide enough so a wagon could fit through it. And then in 1906, they added a second line of tracks and widened the embankment.
So it's wide enough for 2 trains to pass.
Mm-hmm. And that's literally about it.
Yeah. You know, it's really funny because what did I say when we were standing in there? That it's not a huge tunnel, but you could definitely hide a box truck in there.
Yeah. And there is, I don't want to call it a walkway because it's not really. It's mostly just a slick, muddy path that's probably a 45, 50 degree angle that people climb up to get to the tracks near the tunnel. Not recommended, by the way. Don't do this because you can't, it's a straight line, but being a straight line, trains will come up very quickly and your choices are jump to the left down 150 feet or jump to the right down 150 feet, and neither option is a good option.
That's kind of the interesting part that we found about this park. There are really 2 different levels of the legend here. The tunnel itself has a lot of lore around it, almost as much as the ponds and the train wreck. They're interconnected, but at the same time, there's different things that have happened through history that are somewhat individual to each aspect of the park. The train tracks, so the park itself sits very low in a basin, almost as though the entire 12 acres of the park at one point was the quarry, and pieces of it have been filled back in some to create what we see now. From the time that you pull into the driveway leading into the park, you go down a very short, steep hill, and there's sheer cut limestone walls all the way around 3.5 sides of the park. And the houses that back up to the park are all built on their yards, they drop off the edge of a cliff, literally. So it creates this very interesting, sounds seem to be more muffled. It's a very quiet area, even though it's a short walk from a college campus in downtown Delaware. So that was a very unexpected part of the park. The other thing is, with that straight line of railroad track going through there, there's no major intersection that you're going to hear necessarily a train whistle warning you that it's coming down that portion of the track. So if you made the climb up this extremely steep, extremely tall hill and got stuck up there on those tracks, there's no way down.
And unfortunately, I did hear of a story. So one of my coworkers, her husband, is actually a year or 2 ahead of a girl who either committed suicide on the tracks or got stuck on the tracks and was surprised by a train. But regardless, she actually wound up dying. So that's
awful.
One death that it's horrible. That's one death that's happened. They're about my age, so it's happened within the past 20 years.
Wow.
So yeah.
That's just awful.
Reading all the newspapers I read, just so many newspapers, it's fine. I did come across a couple other deaths that happened while the park was still a quarry. So there is an article about an Edward Hall who killed a Joseph Bolden. and he stabbed him to death over a dice game.
Oh, wow.
So apparently in the quarry, I actually found a picture of the quarry, which we'll post on the website, of how it supposedly looked back when it first opened. And there's actually, you can see like what appears to be a couple little houses. So I don't know if they had apartments for the workers sitting there.
Oh, that's cool.
That happened in 1916. And then there was another death of a Raphael Muselli. He died. I'm not quite sure how. I couldn't find anything. The only thing I could find on him was that his wives were seeking compensation for his death because he had a wife in Italy and then married another woman in West Virginia and then left both of them for years before he died. So neither of them got compensation because they weren't dependent on him at the time. So that was like the only thing of him I could find.
What a scuzz.
But that actually brings up another point back to episode 1 where we were talking about Nicholas Hartzell versus Nicholas Catesell and how that happens, because one newspaper, his name was spelt Raphael, and the next time his name popped up was about a year or two later, and his name was spelt Rafele.
Oh.
So
somebody didn't spell check.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how often, as we dig more into history, we'll find things like that.
I'm assuming the big main events aren't going to be like that, but stuff like this is probably going to be more common than we think. And I'm excited to find those things and debunk them and kind of go down that rabbit hole.
So there have been definite recorded accidents and deaths and trauma at this park in that area. However,
yes,
the actual legend of the train, not sold on that personally.
Yeah.
We hiked the entire park in the rain, I might add.
Because we're psychotic.
Amanda even forged the creeks with her boots and got her socks wet. So, I mean, we're...
I think they're still drying.
Oh, your boots or your socks?
I didn't throw them in the dryer. They're just still drying. It's great.
Totally worth it. So we hiked through the entire park in the rain. We went through the tunnel and got to the second pond. The general feeling in the park, and there are reports through every bit of research that I did, every site that I found, of just a general feeling of unease in the park, especially at dusk. Now, we were there close to, probably 10:30, 11 o'clock?
Yep.
So it was nowhere near dusk, but it was a very low cloud cover, rainy, gross, late November day. The way that the first pond is situated to the tunnel, the bridge, it seems very, very, very unlikely that a train would hit the bridge, hit ice, derail, and end up in the water. Also, I believe the reports say that the first pond, which is the one in the park closest to the parking areas, is no more than 10 to 14 feet deep. That's a significant depth, but to drown dozens of people, probably not so much. It's also not, surface area wise, it's not large enough to really hold a passenger train, more than maybe a car or two.
It's probably only an acre if you smushed it down, if that. It's not.
I don't even know if it's that big, honestly. Side note, we did take lots of pictures. We will be posting those to our social media accounts to give you guys an idea of what the park looks like and where we went, just FYI. When we hiked back through the woods and went through the tunnel to the second park, that is where opinions changed, at least for me.
Oh, yes. Definitely for me as well.
The second pond is much closer to the tunnel. It's got a little bit more of a graduated hill up to the track. There's actually a waterfall coming down close to where the bridge is. And if on a straight line like that, the train in the 1920s was hitting as absolute fast as it could possibly go, pushing to make up time, And it came across that bridge going so fast that it was borderline out of control to begin with and hit some ice. It definitely could have been cartwheeled off the track, off the bridge, down that hill, and straight into the deeper of the quarry ponds. I doubt that an event like that happened and there's no recorded history of it. But having looked at and seen how the tracks and the bridge line up to the water, it's feasible that it could have happened.
One of the things I did find when I was looking was in 1916, there was a major accident up in Amherst, which is Cleveland, Lake Erie area. So that's a 2-3 hour drive by today's standards, let alone back in 1916. 27 people died and an additional 50 people were injured. So this was a massive wreck. It took up half of a front page.
In the Delaware papers.
In the Delaware newspaper. So I'm assuming that if whatever accident occurred would be at least half a page.
Especially since you found that article about the guy in the elevator at the quarry.
Yes. So there was a lot of skepticism about how deep things are when you talk about the ponds and the quarries. You can't really judge by today's standards because did they fill things in? Did they not? It's kind of, I can't find anything. But there is a report of a man who was in an elevator at the quarry and the elevator malfunctioned and he died. And if you ask me, if a quarry is only 100 feet deep, you're putting in a ladder, not an elevator.
I don't know. I mean, they might have rigged up some sort of pulley system at 100 feet, but to install an actual elevator, there's got to be a significant depth there. Especially if they're carting out the amount of limestone that you found they did.
Actually, we will skip around a little bit. Stay with me here. In the second pond, which is the one just to the west of the track, is actually 2.5 acres and is often called the Hazelton Quarry after the operator and is currently owned by CSX, which is a railroad company. And then 1930s, the history is kind of sketchy. No one really knows. But then in 1940, they developed it into a private park and cottage. And then in 1956, it became public.
So it hasn't been a public park that long.
Not really. That leads into one of the stats I found was from the 1940s. So we're talking like the very end of the quarry's life. So in the quarry's heyday, annually it produced 1,000 carloads of building stone and 600 to 700 additional carloads of crushed stone. And in 1940, a train car could hold 75 tons of material. So if we're talking 1,600 to 1,700 carloads and each carload is 75 tons, I'm not going to do the math, but that's a lot.
And I have a hard time believing that just out of those small ponds, especially the one in the park, if it's only 12 or 14 feet deep, and like you said, it may have been filled back in some, that they were getting that amount of limestone out per year if the entire park at one point was not part of the quarry.
That's where I kind of fight with, I don't want to assume things and I can't find information, but there's no way I can logically look at this park and go, it hasn't been filled in at some point.
Yeah, it had to have been modified at some point, but at the same time, we were very low in elevation compared to the rest of the town around us. As we were coming up out of the park, leaving the park, we went uphill for quite a while.
It's honestly probably if we stood next to those cut lime walls that the houses were standing on, it would probably be, it tapered. So I think the average would have probably been like 30 or 50 feet high, which is still a decent amount. And I guess over 12 acres, if you're doing an average of 30 to 50 feet, that's still a lot of stone. But when I think those numbers, I still think more than that.
I don't know. Those ponds at some point had to have been extremely deep for it to operate at that level for that long.
Yeah. And then some of the other reports that I found that I have not been able to prove are it's part of cult activity. The Columbus Mafia apparently used the park as a dumping ground at one point. And then supposedly there's a rail car that's still submerged in one of the 3 lakes. No one can agree on which one. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It would not surprise me on one of those back 2 lakes if there was still a train car submerged.
I couldn't find anything about how deep either of those 2 lakes were, but the main lake in the park is definitely only like 10 to 12 feet deep.
I don't know. There was just a different feel in the air on those back 2 lakes, and they don't seem to have, you have to work to get back there. Like, you can't just walk down a paved path or a groomed walking path to get there. You have to go through some water. You have to go through the tunnel. You have to hike through some overgrown underbrush. We did find some strange concrete foundation stones or wall stones. I'm not sure that it was necessarily a foundation or what it would have been a foundation for. It wasn't a very big structure if it was a structure, but it did have some pretty heavy-duty metal pipe and rebar sticking out of it. A couple of them were bent completely in half back on top of themselves, and it was just in a strange spot.
Yeah, there's that which has definitely been there for a long while, which we don't know what it is. It wasn't just one big slab of stone that has been eroded over time. There were definitely individual segments. It was a building at one point or was part of something. It's pretty far away from the railroad, so I don't know what it would even be for.
And it wasn't huge. It was probably 8 to 10 feet by 12 to 14 feet, if it was even that big.
Yeah.
But it was definite segmented building blocks of concrete and rebar that had fallen apart.
That's one I don't hear a lot of people talk about. What I do hear a lot of people talk about is on the west end of the tunnel, there's kind of like this weird concrete, it looks like an upside down cone that's had its tip chopped off. And a lot of people talk about that one and still don't know what that one's for, so your guess is as good as mine. But I don't hear a lot of people talk about the other structures we found.
That structure makes me wonder if it wasn't something, because of where it's situated at the creek, if it wasn't some sort of loading mechanism at some point for the trains carrying limestone out, or some sort of refilling station for steam engines or coal engines, just because of its proximity to the railroad track and the water and the limestone.
That is a good point.
You know, there's all sorts of, well, hey, I grew up on a property that the back property line is an old railroad. So
yeah,
it's not completely unfamiliar to me to see some of those types of structures. And it wasn't so strange that it was, oh, this is a part of something that fell apart. That particular cone-shaped structure, it's right above, almost attached at the top of the tunnel, and then there's a base part of it down by the creek. It's not a far stretch of the imagination that there was some sort of metal something to either load, unload, refuel something for trains.
That's fair. I'll accept that explanation.
Well, thank you. There is a strange stacked rock chimney tower thing in the middle of the second pond.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we have pictures. Please go take a look. I'm sure there's an explanation for it, but it's a very deliberately stacked, hard to tell how tall because there's not a lot out there for a point of reference on size, but probably 15 to 20 foot tall.
Yeah, it's really weird because this particular pond I couldn't get an answer on. I heard people scuba dive in it, and you don't scuba dive in something that's, only a couple feet deep. Also heard of people drowning in this pond, so...
I could see that.
It's weird because there's an island in the middle of the pond, and then this rock structure is just off to the side of it.
And somebody has been out on that island because there was blue and white graffiti out there.
Yeah.
So somebody not only jumped off the rock into this water, but they took spray paint with them. So
there is spray paint everywhere. From the tunnel back to ponds, there's spray paint everywhere. Everybody's tagging everything, and it's kind of sad.
Yeah,
it hurts my soul a little bit.
Some of it was just stupid teenage stuff that's completely unnecessary. Some of it was kind of cool to see. There are a shocking amount of access points to both back ponds from the trail. So there was a couple of places that people obviously were going down there on a regular basis. It was a worn to the dirt, well-defined, single lane wide footpath off the side of the cliff down to a small spot where there's graffiti. There was beer cans, energy drink cans. We even found a little fire ring at the one quarry. So people spend a lot of time back there. It's secluded, but it's not hard to get to.
I know Delaware isn't the most happening place, so I can only imagine as a preteen teenager, there's not a whole lot to do, so that's what you do.
And as we were coming out of the park, you come up out of the park on the road, and right across the light is Ohio Wesleyan University.
Yep.
Their residential halls. So it's cross the road and walk 300 feet from dorm rooms for the college too.
And did you notice that we had explored the two ponds and we were in between them on that elevated walkway, and then we kept going back to that grassy area, but if you kept going,
it led up to those houses.
Yeah, there were houses and a track, so you could theoretically walk from the road to where we were and never cross a creek, never do anything more than just, ooh, look, I stumbled in a hole in the grass.
Yeah.
There were no trees because, once again, telephone lines. So everything's super clear. It's super easy to get to. Coming from the way we were coming from is a little difficult, but then it's even easier if you come from that direction.
Which looked like it led into a neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a back way in that was most definitely a straight shot from a sidewalk. One other point that I wanted to bring up earlier, and I got drawn into the legend of all of this and getting excited about having gone to the park. Oh, I'm not asking you to be sorry. This is awesome. I was doing some reading because at the back of my mind, I thought I had watched like a Ghost Hunters episode at some point or something that talked about limestone. And I couldn't remember if limestone was supposedly a dampener of paranormal activity.
It's super projective.
Or if it was an enhancer of. So
yeah, it's super projective.
I took some time on my lunch break today and did some looking at different properties of limestone associated with paranormal activity. And not only is limestone a well-known enhancer of activity, but so is running water. And if you remember, I was talking about there's a waterfall into one of the ponds, the second pond, and so are railroads. So this park has kind of a trifecta of limestone, lots of water, lots of running water, and an old railroad, which leads to the tunnel has its own set of lore and history that goes far past the train derailed at the bridge.
People report hearing voices in this tunnel. They report seeing weird lights, which there's no way a car would be reflecting into this tunnel from any direction.
No.
And then people also report hearing trains roll by, and there's no trains that roll by. I mean, there are trains that roll by, but they're not very often, and you'd know when a train is coming by.
Those tracks that go over that bridge are the only train tracks close enough to hear even a residual whistle or anything like that. We actually looked on YouTube at one point, and there's a few videos. They're several years old at this point, of different EVPs taken in the tunnel. I don't know how credible that is, simply because it's a tunnel with a running creek going through it, and not a slow, sluggish creek, but a creek that has lots of rock and stone that it goes over. There's a lot of noise, water noise in there. And it hasn't been a very wet fall, so I don't think the water's ever much lower than it is now, would be my guess, that this is probably average. It would be extremely difficult to pick up an EVP over water noise.
Yeah, so this tunnel, once again, water surface to peak of the tunnel is going to be about 30 feet. So it's really acoustic in there to begin with. Just normal talking, we were echoing through the tunnel. And then you have the sound of the creek going by and the sound of birds. And it just, I have a hard time with people have picked up EVPs in there. Not that I don't believe in them, but just that there's so much you can use to discredit them. And the couple EVPs I have listened to are very hard to hear, and what they're supposed to be saying is not what I'm hearing at all.
Agreed. The one that we listened to off of YouTube, it sounded like water droplets to me. I don't know. We sat for what, probably 5 or 10 minutes and tried to hear something other than just drips.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't actively try to do EVPs, but once again, it was cold and rainy and we didn't want to be out longer than necessary.
Yes.
But I feel like in certain spaces, EVPs are a futile attempt, and that is one of those spaces.
Agreed. However, when we went through the tunnel, as we said before, it's probably 45 to 60 feet long. It's not a 2 steps and you're through it kind of tunnel. Coming from the park, from the parking area, going toward the second pond, about 3/4 of the way through, both Amanda and myself had a very strange feeling.
The park in general was pretty peaceful until we got to this section of the tunnel. I got super disoriented and off balance. I couldn't turn around to look at you without feeling like I was going to fall over and the world started spinning. I had to grab the wall to keep myself from falling in. And when you're walking through the tunnel, you're on this concrete slab that's probably 5 or 6 feet off the water surface. So that's not something you want to do, is fall.
No, especially since the creek is probably only maybe 2 to 4 feet deep. So you would definitely
Yeah,
be hitting rock.
definitely not something you want to do. So it was really disorienting. I actually started coughing because I felt like something was squeezing my chest, which is generally how I get physical symptoms of paranormal experiences or paranormal energy, if that sounds right.
I saw it happen. I was 2 steps behind you, and this is not a wide walkway. It's maybe 1.5 to 2 feet wide.
Mm-hmm.
I don't tend to react as sensitively, but even I felt like there was somebody, very large hands pressing down on my shoulders.
Yeah, you actually noticed the like dizzy disorientation first because I felt it was fine, and then I took a couple more steps and was like, oh no, oh, this is not fine.
In the spirit of investigating and trying to debunk, we did notice that the walkway has a slight tilt toward the water, probably to keep water from pooling on that ledge. And when I say slight, I mean slight. It was not enough to be disorienting, especially because it was only for about 6 feet, 8 feet of the tunnel that we felt that.
The slant is probably 3 degrees. It is not, I'll give it 5. I'll give it 5 degrees, but it's throughout the entire tunnel, and it's not enough to make me feel off balance at all.
No, we do enough hiking and riding, and for the love of Pete, you rock climb for fun.
Yeah. So I don't get disoriented easily, so.
No. But we both noticed it, and it wasn't just going through the tunnel the first time. We also noticed it coming back in the same spot. So,
Speaking of going to and coming back, unless you want to continue with this.
no, go for it.
Okay. We also had this weird petrochemical type smell pop up a couple times.
Yes.
The first time it happened was when we were walking along the dock when we first got to the park. And then it happened again on that would be the south side of, it's called Delaware Run is the creek we're talking about. So it happened on the south side of that before we got into the tunnel. It happened again on the other side of the tunnel, and then it happened again on the way back before we had even crossed. Like, we had just left the tunnel and it happened again. So there was no consistent placing, there was no wind. We couldn't figure it out.
And at first, when we first got out to the pier, to the dock that goes out into the first quarry, it's a wet day. It was end of November. So it crossed my mind maybe it's just rotting vegetation, it's leaves that have fallen into the water, and it's creating some sort of smell. They do have an aeration system in the first pond. There's three or four areas that they have little machines out there that create bubbles in the water. And there was lots of ducks around and in the water, and we saw a blue heron fly up out of the first pond. So, I thought maybe it's a natural scent, but you can't miss a smell that smells a little bit like bad diesel fuel.
Yeah, it was definitely not natural.
So, like Amanda said, it wasn't windy and there was no trains that went by. We were the only people in the park until we went to leave, and then of course there's a van that wants to like pull right behind the car. There was no real explanation for it. We didn't find anything. There may be a factory or something in town that produces that smell, and we were just catching whiffs of it as it was drifting across the top of the quarry. But it was something that we smelled several times, and it wasn't a good smell.
No.
Those were really the strangest experiences we had. So, all in all, with all of the lore and legend that goes with the park, it wasn't as spooky as I was afraid it might possibly be.
No, it's a very family-friendly park. The majority of the park, there's 7 or 8 different playground equipments. There's a basketball court. There's, fishing that goes on. There's picnic tables. There's a covered eating section where you can picnic when it rains. And it's a very nice park. It just has some history to it.
So some of the outlandish rumors that we found, probably the most outlandish one, I think, after being there, is the rumors of multiple deaths at the hands of Satanists.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, maybe in bygone times. Not so sure that anything recently would have happened. But again, I kind of feel like after going through a couple hundred newspapers, you would have found at least something that said, hey, we have a cult operating in the area that is putting bodies at the park.
Yeah. And that kind of goes along for me with the Columbus Mafia rumors. I really don't think the Columbus Mafia was driving up to Delaware to dump bodies in a quarry that has a bunch of houses surrounding it.
Yeah, and for it being such a seemingly secluded area in some places, it's not. It's really not that big and it's not that secluded.
Yeah.
I think some of those tales possibly come more from being in the backyard of a university.
Overall, it's a great park, family friendly. People have officially died there. I've seen the newspaper articles on that. I've heard the stories from sources that I trust. So just kind of be respectful, be safe. As fun as it sounds to play on railroad tracks, there's a basketball court, a couple football fields away. Go play on that instead, please. Thank you.
There was a lot to do, it looked like, at the park. It was beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm really personally glad that we did not hear any voices crying for help in the tunnel. I'm really glad that we did not see lights bobbing around the track. I'm glad all the graffiti that we saw was just stupid teenagers writing cuss words on stuff for the most part. There was an alien. We did see a graffitied alien.
There was an alien.
That was cool.
It was pretty cool.
I have a picture. We did not find, there are also several reports of pieces of the bridge and tunnel being strewn around the surrounding areas. There are no pieces of the bridge or tunnel strewn anywhere.
Those might be referring to those blocks we found, and that
Yes.
might just be no one knew what they are, so they called them pieces of the bridge or tunnel. But they're not.
There's definitely was some miscellaneous concrete, smaller pieces of concrete rubble and things. But again, personally, I think that goes back more to there was probably different areas and things that were built to load, unload trains for the purpose of equipment, for the purpose of taking limestone out, refueling the train, refueling equipment at the quarry, that type of thing, more than at some point the bridge was damaged by a train derailment.
Yep. But if you have any stories, any personal experiences, or if you have caught on camera or recording EVPs or lights or anything weird at Blue Limestone Park, please send us an email, ping us on any of our social media. Let us know. We would love to hear.
Oh, yeah, that would be amazing. Because we were there for an hour, that's in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
So,
not saying we did a complete or full investigation, just saying we were there. We didn't see anything or hear anything out of the normal.
Yeah, as always, we are shamelessly begging for your personal experiences, not just at Blue Limestone, not even just in Ohio. But if you have cool stories, if you have local legends that maybe nobody has heard a lot about or is extremely famous in your small town, if you have big legends that everybody's heard about, we still want to hear it. We're loving doing this stuff. We are keeping an eye on all of our social media like hawks. I've gotten yelled at a couple of times just today by Amanda to pay attention to what I'm doing.
It's every 20 minutes. Have you seen these numbers? Yes, Andrea, I've seen the number.
Hey, somebody commented on our post. So you're making my day. Amanda's slightly annoyed with me, but she's loving seeing it too. So
I am.
Send us some information. Send us your stories. You can email us at our email address. It is anatalltales@gmail.com. Amanda also set up a super cool website that you can submit your stories and myths, legends, lore. So go check that out.
And there's also cool behind the scenes stuff that's gonna happen there. So like those photos we took of the park will be posted there in a section. So keep an eye out for that. I'll post an article where I found some of the information so you guys can see some of the pictures and diagrams of the park and just, like, rate, review, all that jazz. If you go exploring, another reminder, be smart, use the buddy system. If something's dangerous, don't do it.
And a huge thank you to everybody who has put us onto some different leads. We have heard some really cool stories about the Hocking Hills area. We've had several people give us tips on a couple of legends down that direction. We will be most likely at some point in the near future taking a look at those. There's a couple of different local legends that I'm thinking we're going to have to do some investigating on.
I'm super excited.
Oh, I am too. It's overwhelming and so appreciated. We will see you next time.
We will see you guys next time.
This has been A&A Tall Tales, an independently written, recorded, and produced podcast. Our intro sounds are Crackling Fireplace by Julius H. and Nightwoods by Widget Studios. Our intro song is Harmonica Solo by Julius H. This podcast is intended for entertainment purposes only.